I've always liked jogging at night. Something about the empty streets, the hush of the world settling in. It's the only time my thoughts don't feel like a tangled mess. It's just me, the sound of my feet on the pavement, and the cold air burning in my lungs. I moved to Portland, Oregon 2 years ago, and my favorite running spot is a little trail in Forest Park, a winding path that cuts through towering pines and old wooden bridges. It's quiet, peaceful. At least, it used to be. It was mid-December, and winter had clamped its frozen fingers around the city. The sky was a deep, suffocating gray, and the ground was slick with ice. Most people holed up in their homes, but I wasn't most people. That night, after another grueling day at work, I pulled on my hoodie, laced up my running shoes, and hit the trail. The cold bit through my clothes, but I didn't care. I just needed to clear my head. 15 minutes in, something changed. At first, it was just a feeling, that prickling awareness, like being watched. You know how sometimes your body just knows before your brain catches up? I slowed down, tugged out one earbud, and glanced around. Nothing. Just the trees swaying in the wind, branches heavy with snow. I told myself it was my imagination. I started jogging again, but I couldn't shake it. The air felt different, thicker somehow. Every sound, the crunch of my shoes, the rustle of the wind, seemed magnified. The back of my neck tingled, and I glanced over my shoulder. That's when I saw him. About 20 feet off the trail, half dead behind a tree, a man. He was standing perfectly still, facing me. His coat was long and tattered, blackened with dirt like he'd been out here for weeks. His hood was pulled up, shadowing his face, but I could feel his eyes, watching. I froze. "Hey," I called, trying to sound casual. "You okay, man?" No response. I don't know why I even asked. What kind of normal person just stands in the woods at night watching joggers? A sane person would have turned around, gone home, maybe even called the cops. But I didn't. I don't know if it was pride or just plain stupidity, but instead of leaving, I shoved my earbuds back in and kept jogging. Like I hadn't seen him. My heart was hammering. After a minute, I looked back. He was closer. Not walking, not running, just closer. I yanked my earbuds out. The only sound was the wind cutting through the trees. I picked up my pace. Something was wrong. I kept glancing back, but every time he was just standing there, motionless, silent, closer than before. By the time I reached the loop in the trail, I made a decision. Instead of following the path back to the road, I cut through the woods. The snow was deep, my feet sinking into the icy crust with each step, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The trees swallowed me whole, their shadows stretching long and twisted in the moonlight. I kept moving, lungs burning, my breath coming out in frantic puffs. Every few steps I stopped to listen. Silence. Then, crunch! I whipped around. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, trying not to be heard. I held my breath. "Who's there?" My voice barely sounded like my own. Nothing. Then, closer. Crunch. The sound of someone stepping forward, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. I fumbled for my phone, fingers shaking. The screen's glow barely cut through the darkness, but it was enough. Enough to see him. 10 feet away. Not moving, not breathing. His coat was soaked now, streaked with mud and ice. His hood had slipped back just enough for me to see his eyes. Wide, unblinking, bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days. I bolted. The branches tore at my clothes, the ground slipping beneath my feet, but I didn't stop. I could hear him now. His footsteps pounding through the snow, chasing me. I broke through the trees, stumbling onto the main road. My car was parked at the curb just a few yards away, so close. That's when I heard it. The sound of running. Not the slow, creeping pursuit from before. Full sprint. I barely had time to react before something slammed into me from behind. I hit the ground hard, ice biting into my skin. My phone skittered across the pavement, screen flickering against the dark. His hands were on me, freezing, rough, gripping my shoulders. He shoved me down harder, pressing me into the frozen ground. I struggled, kicked out blindly. My knee connected with his ribs. He grunted, his grip loosening just enough for me to wriggle free. I scrambled to my feet and ran, half stumbling toward my car. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see him coming after me again. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them, unlocked the door, threw myself inside, locked everything. My breath was coming in sharp gasps as I hit the ignition. The headlights flared to life, cutting through the night, and there he was, standing at the edge of the woods, watching. His hood was down now, and I finally saw his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tight over his cheekbones. His lips were cracked, his mouth hanging open just slightly, like he was trying to remember how to breathe. But it was his eyes that got me. Wide, bloodshot, empty, not with anger, not with fear, just watching. I floored it. The tires spun for a second before catching on the ice. As I sped down the road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. He didn't chase me. He didn't move at all. He just stood there, watching. I don't remember the drive home. I don't remember parking or locking my apartment door behind me. I only remember sitting on my couch, shaking. I never called the cops. What would I even say? Some guy watched me run and tackled me? They'd probably tell me to jog during the day. But I don't jog anymore. I can't. Because every time I think about hitting the trail, I remember his eyes. And I wonder, what if he's still out there, waiting, watching, for someone else? For me. I don't jog anymore. I used to love it, craved the quiet, the solitude. Now, every time I think about putting on my running shoes, I feel those eyes on me, the way he stood there, motionless in the dark, like he was waiting for something or someone. It's been weeks, but my body hasn't forgotten. The way my lungs burned, the way my heart slammed against my ribs. I should have called the cops. Maybe then it would have felt real, but I didn't, and now the only thing real is the way my hands shake when I hear footsteps behind me at night. Maybe that's why I don't talk about it. Some fears you let out into the world and they shrink down into nothing. Others you keep buried because saying them out loud makes them real. The night I stopped jogging, a woman named Linda Calloway was driving down a frozen stretch of highway near Boulder, Colorado. She wasn't running, but she was trying to outrun something. She just didn't know it yet. The drive home from Winter Park should have been peaceful. A weekend in the mountains, fresh air, warm fireplaces, a quiet break before returning to the grind of teaching fourth graders who couldn't sit still for more than 5 minutes. But the snow had started falling faster than expected, and the highway was empty, an endless strip of black asphalt swallowed by towering pines. The kind of road where you don't see another car for miles. The kind of road where people go missing. Linda wasn't thinking about that, though. She was thinking about the wobble in her steering wheel. It had started subtly. Just a small shift, like the tires were fighting the road. Then it got worse. She gripped the wheel tighter, hoping it was just the wind, but when the car lurched to the right, her stomach dropped. Flat tire. Damn it, she muttered. She pulled over, wincing as the car skidded slightly before settling on the icy shoulder. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the headlights, fat and slow, like they had all the time in the world. Linda didn't. She threw the car into park and grabbed her phone. No signal. Of course. She exhaled sharply and opened the door. The cold punched through her coat immediately. A deep, bone-cutting cold that made her skin prickle. She wasn't dressed for this, not really. Just jeans, a sweater, and a jacket that felt thinner by the second. Shivering, she popped the trunk and grabbed the jack and tire iron. It wasn't the first time she'd changed a flat. Wouldn't be the last. But she wasn't counting on how quiet it was out here. No wind, no birds, no distant hum of another car. Just her own breathing and the sound of her boots crunching through the snow. She had just started jacking up the car when she heard it. A sound behind her. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps. She froze, gripping the tire iron tighter. The sound was light at first, careful. Then it stopped altogether. She turned slowly. A man stood about 10 feet away. He hadn't been there before. He was tall, bundled in a thick parka with the hood pulled low. Snowflakes clung to his coat, melting into the dark fabric. His breath curled in the air. He didn't move. Need some help? His voice was rough, rasping like a dull blade against wood. Linda swallowed. Every instinct screamed, no. "I got it," she said, forcing a polite smile. "Thanks, though." The man didn't leave. "You sure?" She nodded, shifting her grip on the tire iron. "Yeah, just about done." That was a lie. The tire was still completely flat. But she didn't want him near her car, near her. His head tilted slightly, and for the first time, she noticed the van. It was parked a little ways down the road, an old, boxy white van, with no windows. She hadn't heard it pull up. She hadn't seen it until just now. Something in her stomach twisted. "You should hurry," the man said, stepping closer. "Storm's gonna get worse." Linda nodded stiffly. She bent down, pretending to adjust the jack, but her fingers were shaking. She didn't hear him move, but when she looked up, he was closer, maybe 2 feet away. Too close. "You know," he said casually, "it'd be a lot easier if I just gave you a ride." His gloved hand shifted slightly, and that's when she saw it. A rope, looped loosely in his grip like he'd just pulled it from his pocket. She stopped breathing. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, without thinking, she dropped the tire iron and bolted for the driver's side door. The snow was slick, and she nearly slipped, but she caught herself. Her hands fumbled for the handle, heart hammering. Behind her, the man lunged. She yanked the door open and threw herself inside, slamming it shut just as he slammed his fist against the window. The whole car shook. Linda screamed. The man's face was just inches from hers, his breath fogging up the glass. "Open the door," his voice was calm. Too calm. She fumbled for the keys, dropped them, his hands smacked against the window again. "Open the door, Linda." She froze. How did he know her name? Her fingers closed around the keys. She shoved them into the ignition, twisting so hard she thought she'd snap the damn thing off. The engine roared to life. The headlights flared, slicing through the snow, illuminating the van. The back doors were slightly ajar. Enough for her to see inside, enough for her to see the lengths of rope. The black tarp, the handcuffs. She didn't think. She didn't breathe. She just hit the gas. The tires spun, struggling for traction, but then they caught. The car lurched forward. The man stepped back, watching. Linda didn't dare look at him. She kept her eyes on the road, on the thin strip of asphalt that stretched endlessly ahead. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely keep the wheel straight. In the rearview mirror, she saw him, just standing there, snow swirling around him, his hood still pulled low. She didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't breathe until she saw the lights of a gas station miles down the road. She pulled in, barely able to park before she started sobbing. The clerk called the cops. She told them everything. They searched, found nothing. No van, no footprints, no trace that anyone had been there at all. The only proof was the bruise on her wrist from where he had almost grabbed her. Linda never drove that road again. And she never changed a tire alone, because she knew, deep in her bones, that man was still out there. And next time, someone else wouldn't be as lucky. There's something about the silence of winter that makes everything feel wrong. It's not just the cold, not just the way snow muffles sound and turns the world into a lifeless void. It's the way things can move in the quiet, unseen, unnoticed, until they're right on top of you. I wonder if Linda Calloway thought about that as she sped away from the man with the rope, as she glanced in her rearview mirror and saw him standing in the falling snow, watching, waiting. I wonder if she ever feels like he's still there, just beyond the edge of her headlights, hiding in the silence. Fear lingers in the places we don't expect, and no one knows that better than Aaron Miles, because sometimes danger doesn't come from the woods. It doesn't come from a deserted highway. Sometimes it's waiting for you in plain sight, at a bus stop in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on a freezing December night. Aaron wasn't the kind of guy who scared easily. He'd been working in diners since he was a teenager, dealing with drunks, creeps, and the occasional late-night fight over cold fries. He knew how to handle himself. But that night, as he sat on the icy bench waiting for the last bus home, something felt off. It wasn't the cold, though it was the kind that made your bones ache, the kind that settled in deep and stayed there. It wasn't the emptiness of the streets, though that was strange too. Normally there were at least a few people shuffling home, heads down, breath curling in the air. Tonight, it was just him. And then, it wasn't. Aaron noticed the man out of the corner of his eye, a shape moving in the shadows. Tall, bundled up in a heavy coat, a beanie pulled low over his head. At first, Aaron thought nothing of it. People came and went, but when the man sat down next to him, too close, closer than anyone should sit when there's an entire empty bench, the unease settled in. Aaron glanced at him. The guy was staring straight ahead, his face half dumb by the shadows. His breath was slow, too slow. Aaron shifted, clearing his throat. "Cold night, huh?" The man didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he turned his head, just slightly. Yeah, he said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. Aaron nodded, staring down at his phone, pretending to scroll. His gut told him to get up, to walk away, but the bus was due in just a few minutes and he didn't want to look paranoid. Something moved. Aaron felt it before he saw it, the slightest brush against his arm. Not an accident, not a shift in weight. The man had touched him. Aaron stiffened. "You got the time?" the man asked suddenly. Aaron forced himself to look up. The guy's hand was still too close. Yeah, almost 12:15. His voice was steady, but his pulse was hammering. The man nodded, but didn't move, didn't thank him, didn't look away. That's when Aaron noticed his other hand. It was inside his coat pocket, gripping something solid. Aaron's mouth went dry. He knew that pose. He'd seen it before. Cooks carried knives that way. Cops carried guns that way. He swallowed hard. "You, waiting for the bus too?" The man smiled. Or at least Aaron thought he did. It was a slight curl of the lips, nothing more. Then, without warning, he lunged. Aaron barely had time to react before the man grabbed his arm, fingers digging into his jacket. "Don't make a sound," he hissed, his face inches from Aaron's. Aaron's heart slammed into his ribs. He struggled, but the guy's grip was like iron. "Wallet," the man growled. Aaron's hands shook as he fumbled in his pocket. The guy's breath was hot against his skin, his fingers tightening. Aaron shoved the wallet at him. The man yanked it open, pulled out the cash, and then shoved the wallet back. That was the part Aaron would never forget. The guy didn't run. He didn't bolt, didn't dart off into the night like a typical mugger. He just stood there, still holding Aaron's arm, staring. Then, after a long, horrible moment, he let go. "Don't follow me," he said, and then he walked away. Not hurried, not panic, just slowly. Like he had all the time in the world. Aaron sat there, heart racing, watching as the man disappeared into the dark. The bus pulled up 2 minutes later. The driver barely glanced at him as he stepped on, his hands still shaking. Aaron sat in the very back, pressing himself against the window, trying to calm down. His wallet was still in his lap, the cash gone, but everything else untouched. The bus rumbled forward. Aaron exhaled. It was over, or at least he thought it was. As the bus passed a side street, Aaron glanced out the window, and his breath caught in his throat. The man was standing at the intersection, watching the bus, watching him. He wasn't moving, wasn't running, just watching. Aaron's stomach twisted. How the hell had he gotten there so fast? The bus kept going. Aaron didn't look back, didn't breathe until he was safe inside his apartment, the door locked, bolted, chained. He never waited for a bus alone again, and for weeks afterward, every time he passed that stop, he felt it. The heavy, silent weight of someone watching. Because sometimes, danger doesn't come from the woods. Sometimes it's sitting right next to you. It's strange, the way fear lingers. You'd think after time passes, after enough nights of locking the door, after enough mornings where you wake up and tell yourself it was nothing, that it would fade. But it doesn't, not really. Aaron Miles still avoids bus stops at night, still flinches when someone sits too close to him, still wonders if that man, the one who took his wallet and left him staring at the street corner as the bus rolled past, is out there somewhere. Watching, waiting. That's the thing about fear. It never really leaves. And Mark Halstead was about to learn that firsthand. Because fear has a way of following you, even on a cold night in Albany, New York, even when it's just you and your dog walking through the park. Mark loved walking Benny late at night. It was the only time he could clear his head after long hours working as a software engineer. The day was nothing but staring at screens, listening to clients who barely knew what they wanted. But at night, it was just him, the cold air, and the sound of Benny's paws padding through the snow. Tonight was colder than usual. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. Snow dusted the park, the icy sheen glistening under the dim glow of the streetlights. The place was empty, just the way he liked it. No kids laughing, no joggers, no cyclists, just quiet. Benny, a golden retriever mix with too much energy, tugged at the leash, his tail wagging as he sniffed at the frozen grass. They walked the usual path, past the empty benches, past the frozen pond where, in summer, kids would gather to feed the ducks. Then Mark noticed the footprints, fresh, leading off the path and into the trees. He frowned. There hadn't been anyone here when he arrived, no sign of other people, no lingering tire tracks in the parking lot. His grip on the leash tightened. Benny whined, his ears perking up. Mark exhaled, shaking off the unease. It was just some other late-night walker, maybe a jogger who took a shortcut. They kept moving, until Benny froze. His body stiffened, his fur bristling, his head turned toward the trees, toward the footprints. And then he growled. Mark had never heard that growl before, a low, guttural sound that vibrated in his chest. "Hey, come on, Benny," Mark murmured, trying to tug the leash. But Benny wouldn't budge. His eyes were locked on the darkness beyond the trees. Mark's pulse picked up. He turned to follow Benny's gaze, squinting into the shadows. Nothing. Just the trees swaying gently in the cold wind. Then Benny barked and bolted. The leash ripped from Mark's hands, burning his fingers. "Benny!" Mark shouted, his voice echoing in the stillness. Benny was gone, vanishing into the dark, his paws kicking up snow. Mark took off after him, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. His shoes slipped on the ice, his legs aching as he sprinted into the trees. Branches clawed at his jacket, at his face. He pushed forward, deeper into the woods, his ears straining for the sound of Benny's bark. Then he heard something else. Footsteps, not Benny's, not his own, someone else. He froze. It was faint, but unmistakable. Crunch, crunch, slow, deliberate, like someone was following him. Mark's breath hitched. He turned, shining his phone's flashlight into the trees. Nothing. Just snow and branches and, no, not nothing, a shape. A man, standing just a few feet away, motionless, watching. Mark's body locked up. His brain screamed at him to run, but he couldn't. He couldn't move. The man wore a dark hoodie, soaked through, clinging to his thin frame. His face was mostly hidden beneath the shadow of the hood, but Mark could see his eyes. Wide, unblinking, dead. Then, Benny barked. The spell shattered. Mark spun and ran, his lungs burned, his legs heavy. Branches ripped at his clothes, the cold air slicing into his skin. Behind him, the footsteps followed. Faster now. Benny was ahead, near the path, barking frantically. Mark pushed himself harder, his body screaming. He broke through the trees. And that's when he saw him. Not the man in the woods, another one, standing near the bench, waiting. A second man, identical hoodie, identical dead eyes. He was holding Benny's leash. Mark skidded to a stop. The man tilted his head slightly, like he was studying him. Mark's chest heaved. His mind raced. The man didn't move, didn't blink. Then, he dropped the leash. Benny sprinted to Mark, pressing against his legs, shaking. Mark's hand clenched around the leash, pulling Benny close. His eyes never left the man. "Who are you?" Mark's voice was barely a whisper. The man smiled, a slow, awful grin that made Mark's stomach churn. Then, he took a step forward. Mark turned and ran. He didn't stop, didn't look back. Benny kept pace with him, his paws slipping in the snow as they tore through the park. The entrance was just ahead, the streetlights spilling a pale glow over the frozen pavement. Mark didn't stop until he was inside his car, until the doors were locked. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely shove the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, the headlights cut through the night, and there they were, both of them, standing at the edge of the woods, watching, still, motionless, identical. Mark's stomach turned ice cold. He slammed the car into reverse, his breath ragged, his skin damp with sweat. As he sped away, Benny whimpering in the passenger seat, he checked the rearview mirror. The men hadn't moved, hadn't chased him, hadn't run. They were just standing there, smiling. Mark didn't go back to the park after that, and he never walked Benny at night again, because he knew some things don't just watch you, some things wait. Fear doesn't leave you, not really. You think it does. You tell yourself that you've moved on, that you've shaken the thing that made your skin crawl, that you don't feel the weight of its presence anymore. But it lingers. It burrows in, makes a home in the back of your mind, waits for the quiet moments, for the nights when the world feels a little too still. Mark Halstead learned that. He didn't go back to the park. He never took Benny on another late-night walk. But he still felt it, that sense of being watched, of something waiting. He still avoided looking too long into dark spaces, because what if it was still there? Watching, smiling. Rachel Hayes wasn't thinking about fear when she pulled up to the rental cabin in the Appalachian Mountains. She was thinking about silence, about escape, about finally getting a break from the chaos of the hospital, the endless hours, the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. The cabin was supposed to be peaceful, isolated, perfect. She should have known better. The place looked like something out of a postcard. A small A-frame nestled between towering pine trees, smoke curling from the chimney, the windows glowing soft and golden against the creeping dusk. Snow blanketed the ground, untouched except for the winding driveway leading up to the cabin. Rachel parked, cut the engine, and exhaled. Nothing but quiet. She grabbed her bag and stepped out, her boots crunching against the frozen ground. The air was sharp, biting against her cheeks. She pulled her coat tighter, already looking forward to curling up by the fire with a glass of wine. The inside of the cabin was even better than the pictures. Warm, rustic, with a stone fireplace and thick wooden beams stretching across the ceiling. It smelled like pine and old wood, like something lived in, but not quite abandoned. She set her bag down and wandered through the space. A small kitchen, a cozy living room, a bedroom tucked away in the back. There was a loft above with a narrow wooden ladder leading up to what she assumed was an extra sleeping area. She didn't bother checking, it was just her, and she had no plans to use it. Rachel poured herself a glass of wine, settled onto the couch, and let out a slow, contented sigh. For the first time in months, she felt at ease. That lasted until the scratching started. It was faint at first, so soft she almost didn't notice it, just a light, skittering sound, like something moving above her. Rachel froze. She glanced at the ceiling. Nothing. Probably just an animal, she told herself. A squirrel, maybe, or a raccoon nesting in the attic. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The sound came again, a long, slow dragging, like something shifting. Rachel swallowed hard, setting her wine glass down. The fireplace crackled, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. She took a breath. It was fine, just an animal. She locked the bedroom door that night anyway. She woke up to footsteps. The hatch was locked. Rachel stared at it, her fingers tightening around the pull cord. Something about it felt wrong. The dust covering the floor was undisturbed. No footprints. No signs of movement. Nothing to suggest anyone or anything had been there at all. But she had heard it. She had heard something. Rachel locked the bedroom door again that night. She almost convinced herself she was imagining it, until the whispers started. Low, faint, like someone muttering just on the other side of the attic hatch. Rachel sat up in bed, clutching the covers, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't make out the words. Didn't want to. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier, like she wasn't alone. She grabbed her phone, hands shaking as she dialed the rental owner. The call went straight to voicemail. Rachel's stomach twisted. She didn't sleep at all. The next morning, she made her decision. She was leaving. She packed her bag in record time, shoved on her coat, and practically ran for the door. She yanked it open and stopped cold. The road was gone. Snow, deep, impassable. Her car was buried, the windshield a solid sheet of ice. The storm had rolled in overnight, and now she was trapped. Rachel let out a shaky breath. Just wait it out. The plows would come eventually. She locked the door behind her and sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel. She just needed to wait. She could feel it before she saw it, the weight of something watching. Slowly, Rachel turned her head, and her breath stopped. Up in the attic window, a face, pale, sunken eyes, watching. Rachel's body locked up. Her mind screamed at her to move, to do something, anything. But she couldn't. She couldn't look away. The woman in the attic tilted her head. And then she smiled. Rachel's scream ripped through the silence. She threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning uselessly against the ice. She slammed her hands against the wheel, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she looked back at the window, the woman was gone. The whispers started again that night. Rachel sat curled up on the couch, clutching the fire poker like a lifeline. The storm raged outside, wind howling against the cabin. She kept her eyes on the attic hatch, waiting, dreading. She didn't sleep, didn't dare. By morning, the storm had passed. Rachel didn't pack, didn't stop to think, she just ran. The car struggled against the ice, tires skidding, but she didn't stop, didn't look back. She drove straight into town, straight to the rental office. The woman behind the desk frowned. "That cabin hasn't been rented in months." Rachel stared at her. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I booked it last week." The woman frowned. "Checked the records." "Nothing." Rachel's mouth went dry. "That's impossible," she whispered. The woman hesitated. Then, slowly, "We don't rent that cabin anymore," she said. Rachel's blood turned to ice. "Why?" The woman glanced over her shoulder, as if making sure no one was listening. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Because the last woman who stayed there?" She leaned in. She never left. Rachel Hayes never spoke about what happened in that cabin. She could still hear the whispers in her sleep, still see the woman's sunken eyes watching from the attic window, still feel the cold panic that gripped her as she tore down that icy road, never looking back. Some things you bury deep. You tell yourself they weren't real. That's the only way you move on. But fear doesn't fade. It lingers, settling into the cracks of your mind, waiting for the right moment to remind you. Detective Owen Grayson knew this all too well. The first time he heard about the disappearances, he thought it was just another case, something explainable. People go missing all the time. But this wasn't normal. This wasn't something that made sense. The stories were too similar, too precise. It had been happening for years. A man disappearing from a jogging trail in Oregon. A woman nearly taken on an empty highway in Colorado, a mugging in Minneapolis that left more questions than answers, a dog walker in New York who never went back to the park, a woman in a cabin who saw something that shouldn't have been there, and every single one of them, every person who had survived whatever it was, said the same thing. They had been watched, followed. Something had been there. Something that wasn't human. Owen had spent 30 years as a cop in Michigan, and he thought he'd seen it all. But the pattern was there, woven through the reports like a sickness that wouldn't die. And it always led back to the same place, Lake Holloway, a frozen stretch of water on the outskirts of town, untouched except for the occasional fisherman or reckless teenager daring each other to step out onto the ice. It had been the site of disappearances before. Too many. And yet no one ever talked about it. The reports faded, the names were forgotten. But Owen couldn't forget, because he had seen it too. Years ago, when he was still on the force, a boy had gone missing out at the lake, a quiet, cold January night. No witnesses, no signs of a struggle, just his footprints leading out onto the ice, ending abruptly in the center. No cracks, no body, just vanished. And Owen had been the one to look out over that lake, to squint against the wind and snow and see something standing there. Something that shouldn't have been. He never told anyone. Not then, not after. But he hadn't forgotten. And now, years later, he was back. The lake was still, the ice stretching out like an endless sheet of glass beneath the moonlight. Owen stood at the edge, his breath curling in the cold, his fingers tightening around the flashlight in his hand. He didn't know what he was looking for, or maybe he did. He stepped onto the ice. One step. Then another. The wind whispered through the trees, the sound of his boots scraping against the frozen surface, the only noise in the silence. The lake had always been like this, too quiet. Then he saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the lake. Owen's pulse slammed against his ribs. He lifted the flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. The figure didn't move. It stood still, wrapped in a long coat, its face obscured by shadow, just like they all described. Just like the man in the woods, the man by the van, the man at the bus stop, the one who had grabbed the leash, the one who had watched from the attic window. Owen's stomach twisted. This wasn't just one person. This wasn't something that could be caught. It was something else. His breath hitched. The figure was gone. Owen blinked. The space where it had been was empty, nothing but ice and darkness stretching out before him. Then, a sound. Behind him. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Coming closer, Owen turned sharply, his breath caught in his throat. Nothing, just the trees. The flashlight flickered. Owen's fingers clenched around it. He swallowed hard. He needed to go. He took a step back toward the shore, and the ice cracked beneath him, his body locked up. The sound was deafening in the stillness. Another crack, another, like something moving beneath him, something under the ice. Owen's breath came in short bursts. He took another step. Too fast. The ice gave way. He plunged downward, the water swallowing him in an instant. Freezing, heavy, his lungs screamed. He kicked, tried to claw his way back to the surface, but the ice had sealed shut above him. He pounded against it, his vision blurring, darkness. And then, a face. Right above him, looking down, smiling. The same face, the same eyes. All of them. The man in the woods, the man by the van, the man at the bus stop, the man with the leash, the woman in the attic, all of them, watching, waiting. Owen's body jerked as he fought against the water, his lungs burning, screaming, and then everything went black. The next morning, the ice was solid again, no cracks, no signs that anyone had been there at all, just a single set of footprints leading onto the lake, ending in the middle. Like they always did, like they always would. Because the thing about fear is that it doesn't leave. It waits, it watches, and sometimes, when the air grows cold, when the night is still, when you step into the wrong place at the wrong time, it takes you too. Fear is a strange thing. It creeps in when you least expect it, settling in the corners of your mind, whispering doubts, making you second-guess what you see, what you hear, what you feel. The stories you've just heard aren't about monsters lurking in the dark. At least, not in the way you'd think. They're about something far more terrifying, the unknown. Ethan thought he was alone on his nightly jog. Until he wasn't. Linda thought she had control of the situation, until she saw the rope in the man's hand. Aaron sat at a bus stop surrounded by streetlights, in a place where people should be safe, but he wasn't. Mark thought he was just walking his dog, until the leash wasn't in his hands anymore. Rachel believed she had found a peaceful getaway, until she realized she wasn't alone in the cabin. And Owen? He went looking for answers, but some truths should never be uncovered. Each of them thought they were safe. Each of them thought fear was something that could be ignored, something that would go away if they just kept moving. But fear doesn't leave. It follows. It waits. So what's the lesson here? What do we take away from these stories? First, trust your instincts. Fear isn't always irrational. That strange feeling in your gut when someone gets too close, the unease creeping up your spine when you feel watched, the sense that something is wrong even when everything seems normal. Those aren't coincidences. Your body knows when danger is near. Listen to it. Second, Never ignore the small signs, a figure in the woods that stands too still, a van parked where it shouldn't be, footsteps that don't belong to you, a locked attic door that should have stayed that way. The little things, the ones that make your skin prickle, are often the warnings we're meant to heed. Most people write them off. Most people convince themselves they're overreacting. But those are the moments that matter most. Third, not all dangers can be explained. Some things aren't meant to have answers. Some things exist in the spaces we don't understand, waiting in the cracks of reality, watching from the dark. We spend our lives looking for logic, for explanations, for reasons that make sense. But what if the scariest truth is this? Some things just are. And finally, never assume you're alone because you aren't. Because you aren't. It's a stranger standing too close at a bus stop. Maybe it's footprints in the snow that weren't there before. Maybe it's something else. Something that doesn't breathe, doesn't speak, doesn't move until it wants to. Be on it's watching you right now. Be for the right moment. To remind you that fear never really goes away. Thank you for stepping into the darkness with me tonight. If you've made it this far, you're braver than most. But tell me, have you ever felt it? That unshakable sense that something isn't quite right? Have you ever turned around and seen nothing, but known deep in your bones that something was there? If so, you're not alone. Not really. And you never will be. This has been Enigma of the Unknown. Stay safe out there. Until next time.